Welcome to Tangents from Coin Center. I'm Jerry Brito, Executive Director of Coin Center, and with me I've got Peter Van Valkenburg, Director of Research at Coin Center. Hi, Peter.
Hello.
And Robin Wiseman, who is our Senior Policy Counsel. Hi, Robin.
Hello.
All right. So today we're going to talk about the infrastructure bill, which there was a lot of activity on a few months back, a lot of quite intense activity. And I think a lot of folks have been asking us about this because they saw us be very active on this and sort of raise the alarm about this and give lots of updates on a daily and even hourly basis during this intense fight in the Senate that thankfully a lot of folks in crypto Twitter and the crypto community got involved in. But since then, the bill passed the Senate, it's been radio silence. And so I think people want to know what's up, what's the latest and all that. So we're going to give an update today. And I guess the first thing we should do is maybe talk about the bill itself and what's in it, just to kind of understand that. So Peter, what's in the bill?
What's an infrastructure bill?
That's right. That's right. It's actually so number one, it's a bipartisan infrastructure bill, which means that it has support from all the Democrats in the Senate and a few Republicans who came together to write a 1,000+ page bill that would basically fund highways and bridges and tunnels and airports and things like that. But why is why is crypto in here?
You're saying, Jerry, you're saying it's not because crypto is public infrastructure?
No,
because it is.
It's public infrastructure, but it's not state-provided public infrastructure,
Yes.
which is a thing. Private public infrastructure is a thing, right, Peter?
It is a thing.
Yeah.
It is a thing. So why is crypto in the infrastructure bill if it's not getting money as public infrastructure? It's where you get money to spend on public infrastructure. The crypto provision was a pay for, as they say. It was a provision that would pay for the infrastructure.
Right. And so we'll get to what a pay for is and why it's in there. But so what is in the provision itself?
Well, a few things. So specifically, it changes the definition of broker for tax reporting purposes, for third-party tax reporting purposes. So, typically speaking, if you have an individual who plays a role as a middleman in financial transactions, and so it's a broad definition. It's not narrow like when we say brokerage or broker, we don't just mean securities. This is the tax law, not the securities law. Somebody who manages your investments for you, hooks you up with places to buy, super hot stocks and things. They're going to be a broker under the tax provision, and that means they'll have to do something called third-party reporting, which means they're going to keep track of your trades and figure out your basis and your capital gains and give you a copy of what they think you might owe this coming year. And they are also going to give a copy of that to the IRS so that you'll be gently incentivized to, honestly report your capital gains because the IRS probably already knows them. But we have a self-reporting regime, so the IRS still wants you to, own up to it.
And so that's the law right now, right? So there's a definition of broker in the tax code. And if you are a broker, you need to provide a 1099 to to your customer that has their capital gains and all that. And you also have to give that information to the IRS. What this crypto provision in the tax code, in the infrastructure bill would do is expand the definition of broker to go beyond people who are middlemen, as the tax code has it, to include people who are basically facilitating transactions, right? Not just actually executing the transactions, but merely facilitating them. And that would capture potentially the way that it's written. It could be interpreted to capture all kinds of people, like miners. Do miners facilitate transactions? Yeah, they do. Do developers, of different software that interacts with the network, Yes, they do. They could potentially facilitate or help facilitate transactions, et cetera. So very dangerous. Yeah, but nevertheless, it's there.
Right. I mean, so very dangerous. Why would Coin Center oppose this? As we say often, we have no problem
Yeah.
with people trading Bitcoin paying their taxes. Indeed, we think they should, and that's important. This is not about, people not paying their taxes. This was about a poorly drafted definition that was so broad that it could effectively occupy the field of cryptocurrency and treat just about everyone who's playing some role on these networks as a broker, and force them therefore to collect information on other people in the cryptocurrency ecosystem who are not their customers. You're not the customer of a miner. You're not the customer of a software provider who built a software wallet that you happen to hold your Bitcoin in. And so why then would this person be classified as a broker who needs to learn about your transactions and report them to you and the IRS when there is no customer and broker relationship there? They are not a middleman. And it's an existential threat in the vein that we've seen before, of potentially creating really onerous surveillance obligations for persons in the cryptocurrency ecosystem who are, as we always say, non-custodial, who don't provide that service to customers and therefore shouldn't be obligated in a way that crushes their ability to function as providers of a public good, as providers of the network.
Yeah, and I think what folks at Treasury or some of the drafters here might say to that is, yeah, but there are all kinds of actors that do serve a middleman-like function and call themselves decentralized, but they are performing that function, and we want to make sure we can capture them. And to that, I would say, well, if they're performing that function, then they are middlemen. I don't care what they call themselves.
I think that's right. I guess I've just never understood what the intent of the language was. Because as we've said before, if the intent is to cover digital currency exchanges that are centralized, and maybe that's why this is able to pay for a lot of infrastructure, because if God knows if Coinbase and Kraken and the other centralized exchanges weren't doing some kind of third-party reporting at all, although I think they are. In fact, I've gotten forms before from them. Then there would be probably a big gap. And so I'd understand this being a good way to raise revenue to pay for infrastructure if you were covering these people who weren't covered before and were substantial middlemen in the cryptocurrency space. But they are middlemen. They're already middlemen. Like the existing definition of broker easily covers those people. And so my question is to the people who originally came up with this language, and I don't know who they are. I mean, you suggested Treasury or something like that, but what was meant to be covered? And do you really think that that deputizing those people to do surveillance would raise that much revenue? Are there that many people not paying their taxes that frightening them with surveillance from people who shouldn't even be obligated to do surveillance is likely to raise revenue? I don't think so.
Yeah. And
well, I also would just like to say that beyond that, I mean, it creates an obligation on people or on entities, not even people, that have no actual way of complying with what's required. Yeah. And even if Treasury were to say, and others have said that they weren't intending to cover these entities, they're still technically covered legally. So you're creating a legal obligation on people that can't comply. And that's a very dangerous precedent to set.
Yeah, or at least it would have a new definition that can be interpreted to cover them. And so, ultimately, if this becomes law, Treasury is going to put out rules that say who exactly is covered. And it may be that in their wisdom, the folks at Treasury will understand that they can't seriously put minors into, as one of the kinds of people who would be covered. And so great. But the fact that the definition is expanded to be so broad means that at any point, a future Treasury could just add them.
Right.
Well, and this goes to the larger conversation that we've had before of that certain fundamental policy choices, when they're novel questions raised by new technologies, shouldn't be made at the regulatory level, shouldn't be made by unelected officials. They should be made by Congress. I mean, like it was completely reasonable for FinCEN to say, look, people who hold people's money, whether it's crypto or dollars, are the same. So a Coinbase is like a PayPal. That's a reasonable use of administrative power to create rules. But to wholesale create new categories of persons that are obligated to surveil their customers, to me, that is something that Congress should do, not necessarily the Treasury, you know.
And while we're riding our hobby horses, I'll say that not only should it be done in Congress, but it should be done through regular order, right? It is not proper to legislate when you've held 0 hearings, have not really consulted anybody who would be affected, and just ram it through in a must-pass piece of legislation at the last minute.
Yeah.
That's just not the way that you properly do legislation.
And it is the frustrating thing about it being a pay for, is that this isn't a discussion about crypto policy. This was just a discussion about finding extra loose change in the couch to pay for a bunch of infrastructure.
Right.
We're being abused.
And so to answer your question, Peter, about, who do they think they were covering? We don't know ultimately, because, once this bill was introduced and it was, and the expanded definition was there, I kept asking kind of publicly, who's it supposed to cover? Because clearly the existing broker definition already covers exchanges like Coinbase and Kraken and the like. So who's it supposed to cover? And a hint, and I never got any answer to that, right? They would, statements from Treasury would come back and they would say, we're not trying to cover developers. We're not trying to cover, people who shouldn't be, people who aren't brokers, which is, it would always say that we're not trying to cover people who aren't brokers, which is kind of begs the question of, if you're defining broker, then by definition, you're not going to cover people. Okay.
If you're redefining brokers, you're
Right.
actually trying to cover people who aren't currently brokers. Otherwise, There's no reason to redefine broker.
But we can get a hint about who this might have been aimed at when we look at the original draft of this provision before it was introduced. And so this is not the draft that ultimately became the bill that passed the Senate, because we and others were able to push back on this language. But here's how it originally read. The expanded definition of broker would read: any person who, for consideration, regularly provides any service or application, even if non-custodial, to facilitate transfers of digital assets, including any decentralized exchange or peer-to-peer marketplace. And so, that gets to who I think they're aiming to cover. And it seems to me that that's a misunderstanding, right? So decentralized exchanges, we often talk about, is a verb, not a noun. And if you could find a noun like decentralized exchange that you could put these obligations on, well, then it's already covered, right? Because they're a broker. And otherwise, this is just totally improper to cover that kind of, a software developer who merely publishes software.
How did it get scored as so much of a pay for if it doesn't seem to actually cover that many more people?
Robin?
Well, that's a super interesting question. So, well, first of all, there are other provisions. There are other aspects of this provision other than the expanded definition of broker, which we should talk about. But just to take a little detour into the pay for aspect of it. So the pay for, it's scored, and the scoring process it's a very opaque process. We don't exactly know what went into it, but we did have some hints.
Can I just say what scoring means? Scoring means that there's a special committee in Congress that looks at the draft and says, here's how much money it would raise.
It was 28 billion, right?
It was 28 billion.
Yeah.
And then every time we worked to try to have the definition of broker limited to just what people at Treasury and people on the Hill were saying, it should only cover. So for example, we'd say, well, if you don't think it should cover developers or software or miners, let's make clear in the language that it doesn't cover developers or software or miners. And then it would go back to this process of the scoring process. And inevitably the score went down by $5 billion. So it went from a $28 billion bill to a $23 billion pay for, And we were really dumbfounded as to how that could happen. Because it's like, well, if you don't intend to cover those people, and we're going to have language that clearly articulates that they're not covered as the definition of broker, how are you then losing money?
Right.
Like it didn't make any sense.
If anything, they should have gained some money because, if it had passed as it was, the kind of uncertainty it would create in the industry would probably decrease tax revenue as companies move overseas.
Yeah.
Well, at the very least,
I'm
it shouldn't
serious.
have okay, but at the very least, it shouldn't have lost money, right? Because if you were really being careful with the drafting, then it shouldn't have lost money.
So let's move on onto what else is in it, because I think as we've seen right now, the broker definition kind of sucked all the oxygen into about what's in the bill. And there are a couple of other things that we don't like about this bill. We're opposed to. And by the way, the other reason, and we'll get to this later on, the other reason broker got all the attention is because that's the one thing that we had members of the Senate agreed should be fixed, right? There was clear bipartisan agreement on that. And so that's where we could work to get that fixed. The other things, there wasn't as much really interest in fixing. So the second thing is basically it expands the reporting that brokers would have to do from just transactions, right? You buy, you sell, but to mere transfers. And by the way, this is only for crypto, not for anything else, not for stocks, not for commodities, not for anything else. Only for crypto. Digital asset brokers would have to report information to the IRS about you, not merely when you trade, but when you merely transfer. And not just when you transfer between financial institutions, but when you transfer between your exchange and some self-hosted wallet. So if you're just sending money to yourself, that's going to get reported. And that's a big sort of expansion that is not technology neutral. It's not a good idea.
So, on this one, I'm a bit more sympathetic with the definition of broker. I think there's a certain kind of absurdity to that whole conversation we just had, where if you're expanding it, but you don't want to cover more people, but why are you expanding it? And does it actually raise money? It's all kind of crazy to me. And the end result was language that would just create uncertainty as to whether non-middlemen need to report on people. The expansion. So if we set that aside and say, okay, just true middlemen are going to have new rules when they're dealing in cryptocurrency as opposed to securities or other things as to what they have to report, I'm somewhat sympathetic. If only for the one reason that when you go to Charles Schwab and you buy a bunch of shares of a mutual fund, there's an option then to sell them, and that will trigger reporting. There's not really an option to send the mutual fund to your friend Bob, who's going to hold it on their smartphone, without someone else, without a third party. Whereas with Bitcoin, that is the case. Most of the time when you're using a digital currency exchange, you're buying and selling maybe, because people don't tend to use these things for payments, but you will also at one point ask this person maybe to just send sight unseen to a random address as if it was electronic cash.
Sure.
And that means you've got flows going in and out in a way that you might not traditionally have. So if it was not, I still have problems with this, but if it was more generically drafted to say, we're going to need to figure out how these exchanges do self-reporting in light of this added complication, I understand, especially because as someone who has received, I think, a 1099K from a digital currency exchange, and therefore had some tax questions, I was alarmed because they had marked a lot of transactions that I was making from the exchange to my own wallet as a taxable event, when that is not a taxable event. And so they obviously needed guidance from the IRS.
Yeah. So
probably not what we wanted, right?
No. So just a couple things, Robin. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Before, just because I've got to answer this. So number one, I think you're absolutely right. The way you address this is not by having some digital asset specific part of the legislation. What you do is that you say that brokers have to report, all brokers have to report all transactions and all transfers, right? And then if it only applies to some people, that's fine. So you do it A, more generically. B, the devil's going to be in the details of the implementation of something like this, because you're going to have the same problems that you would have had with the FinCEN self-hosted wallet rule that you had in December, right? Which is if I have to, if the IRS, sorry, if my exchange has to report to the IRS the personal information of my counterparty when I'm transferring funds to somebody, well, number one, that person is not my exchange's customer. So we have sort of a Fourth Amendment question there. But also, what if my counterparty is some vending machine on the Ethereum network, right? There is no PII to give. And all of that was kind of missing.
It was missing. It was left up to the Treasury. And so the Treasury would be given another opportunity to push for counterparty record keeping, and that would have been very bad. It's important to note that the infrastructure bill itself did not mention counterparties as people who needed to be known by these brokers. It left that open. It was vague.
And the last thing I'll say, sorry, Robin, before I give the mic to you, is when you say, Peter, that you got 1099K from an exchange that had these kinds of transactions where you were just basically withdrawing to yourself, well, that is precisely the reason why we and the exchanges and users have been pleading with the IRS and with Treasury for years to please issue guidance on how exchanges can do 1099s. The 1099K thing, I think, is a kludge that exchanges have glommed on to try to do something compliant, right? But if they had good guidance, and this requires no laws, requires no regulation, just good guidance from the IRS on how to do proper, normal 1099 reporting for digital assets. And so not only have we asked for this publicly, but we've also worked with members of Congress to draft the Cryptocurrency Tax Fairness Act, which has been introduced in the last 3 Congresses, which, among other things, directs Treasury to do guidance for third-party reporting by exchanges. So we're not against reporting. We've been asking for good reporting. Sorry, Robin, the rant.
That's okay. You're actually, the third part of your rant was what I was going to say, which is, well, it's 2 things. It was part of what I was going to say. One thing is that the bigger point is, and we've talked about this before, the fact that they were trying to put this as a pay for on an infrastructure bill, and there was no regular order process for considering this, is exactly why we have these problems, because this is a very big problem, and it is unique to crypto. Like Peter, you could say, like, you're sympathetic because you can do certain things with crypto that you can't do in your Schwab account, but that's exactly the reason why there should be hearings or a full regulatory process with opportunity for notice and comment and input, so that we could help, which we do, help policymakers meet their ends, but also accounting for the uniqueness of this technology and the policy issues that it raises. And we didn't have the chance to do any of that. And so we ended up with this provision that doesn't really make sense. And also, I think it's important to say, we are not here to say that people shouldn't pay their crypto taxes. This is what Jerry was saying. We've been saying for 6 years, for as long as we've been operating, that there should just be better, more clear rules. And we've done that by helping work on the Cryptocurrency Tax Fairness Act, helping to engage with the IRS, helping to engage with members of Congress who are writing letters to the IRS seeking more clarity. And so this whole conversation is a little frustrating because it's something that really could have been avoided if there was a proper notice and comment and exchange of ideas around these provisions.
Right, because the IRS doesn't need new authority in the statute, in the infrastructure bill, to offer this guidance. It could have done this years ago, and Coin Center is not the only organization out there criticizing them for not doing this. The Tax Inspector General, the Taxpayer Inspector General, there's a
Inspector General for Tax Policy, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, something.
They've written reports, multiple reports, criticizing the IRS's slow approach to addressing issues in this space. One of the big ones being self or third-party reporting.
So, and it's almost as if Treasury had rules ready to go that would have taken account into all of this that they were about to put to public comment, but we'll get to that in a minute.
We'll get to that later. Yeah, but
what's the last
the other provisions?
Yeah,
the last
so
provision.
Peter,
well, there's actually there are 2. But before we get to that one, do we also want to talk about? There's also the definition of a digital asset.
Yeah. So we look at the definition of digital asset, and it's just there's no good way, in my opinion, to define digital asset in a way that's satisfying to everybody, that doesn't have some corner case that would be weird for somebody. And from our perspective, we look at it, and no matter how you define digital asset in law, 100% it's going to cover Bitcoin, it's going to cover Ethereum, and it's going to cover things like them.
Yeah.
So from our perspective, it's like, but if I was a game company that had in-game currency, or if I was an airline that had airline miles, I would be worried about the definition of digital asset in this.
But American Airlines doesn't need us to lobby for them.
No, but also within the definition of digital asset, I mean, just because we're giving a full explanation of what the whole provision does, within the definition of digital asset, there's also a lot of leeway left to the Secretary of Treasury to define what that is. So it's not just, and so this is yet another place where there's a little wiggle room. I feel like there's, in the definition of broker, there's some regulatory wiggle room. In the definition of like who's going to report and on what transactions, there's so many different ways that this can get expanded. This goes to Peter's question about how does it raise so much money, or how come and for my question that I posed to myself, why did the score go down? There are all these ways that you could continue to like shake the couch for change.
Yeah. So Robin, you bring up an excellent point. I forgot about that, but yeah, and this goes to Peter's non-delegation issue. The definition of digital asset in this bill not only says it's these things, but then it has a clause at the end that says, and anything else the secretary says is a digital asset.
Decides is a digital asset.
So I guess you have to, plausibly make a case to a judge that it's within the words digital and asset, but really, I mean, he could say,
I mean, you two are wearing headphones. Those could be digital assets.
Yeah,
it's funny. If the scoring was honest, they'd say it gives so much leeway to the secretary to decide how to enforce it. This could raise between -300 billion and +1 trillion, depending on what he decides to tax or not tax and treat as a currency or not currency.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So now we can get to the other.
Now it's like what could be the most egregious.
I think it is.
Yeah. Why don't you explain it?
Sure. So the final thing, and this, as Jerry said earlier, this didn't have as much juice for us to fight in the brief time we had to fight for it in the Senate. So this is why it wasn't a big news story back then, even though it should have been, because it's probably the most privacy invasive aspect of the infrastructure bill, is what I refer to in short as 60/50I reporting, which is, we need better branding, I guess, but I think
cash-like reporting.
Yeah, I like cash-like transactions.
Cash
That's a better way.
Cash-like coins, right? Isn't it? Anyway,
yeah.
So in the existing tax code, if you are in a trade or business transaction and someone pays you $10,000 or more in cash or physical currency, you don't only need to report that you've earned income, say, as part of your business, or had revenue as part of your business. You need to collect information about the person who's paying you to basically report on their activities to the IRS, so that we have a better idea of whether everyone's paying their taxes. So this is it's almost like third-party reporting. This isn't just, I need to tell the IRS about my activities. It's when someone comes to me with cash, that's inherently suspicious. And so I should be obligated to sort of collect a bunch of information about that person who's trying to pay someone else in cash to the tune of $10,000 or more, including their social security number, their physical address, their name, really private stuff that if it was to, if it was just to be breached in a cybersecurity hack, would be really bad for these people who get reported on. And I need to give that to the IRS. And so
can I put a point on this? Because I think it's, I like to make it concrete for folks. Let's say that you are an antique dealer and you have a stall at the flea market, and I come by and I see a beautiful antique oak desk and I say, this is beautiful, I would love to buy it. How much is it? And you say, well, this is
$12,000.
This was Thomas Jefferson's. This is,
$50,000.
Okay. And I say, sure thing. And I give you.
And I bring my suitcase.
I pull out my bag of money and I plop it on the desk.
Yep. And I give you, $12,000 in cash. This is not part of your, as a normal course of your business, you don't care. We're a flea market.
I would think I'll give you a receipt and you take the thing, I take the cash. That's what I would do.
Right.
It's not right.
Right. And so in cash, you probably don't see this a lot, but I can totally imagine that in crypto, somebody would, from their self-hosted wallet, hand over $12,000 worth of Bitcoin for the antique desk. But anyhow, so it puts an obligation on a merchant at a flea market to get the name, social security number, address of the person that they're selling something to for cash.
That's right. And like, it's in theory just for business transactions and receipts from business and trade, but that doesn't have a clear and narrow definition. Like this could in theory be relevant to just a babysitter. I mean, it wouldn't be for $10,000, but maybe for recurring payments to a nanny or something like that. Could easily be that much money. This is for small businesses or even just individuals who are engaged in some sort of business. This isn't like reasonably calibrated to only hit like when you rent a giant warehouse and pay for it in cash or something like that. It could be small transactions. Abraham Sutherland, who is a legal expert in this space, who's worked with the Proof of Stake Alliance and has flagged this issue alongside us, actually bought a used car recently and decided, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to see what this whole reporting regime is like. And so he was like, all right, I'm going to take out some cash and pay for, I think he paid some of it with a certified check, and for some of it he paid with like $12,000 or $13,000 in cash, and talked to the guy and was like, you used to filing these 8300 reports under the 6050I provision, which would normally be like alien speak, but the used car salesman was like, yeah, actually we still get a few of these. Not too many people anymore coming in with cash, but we still get a few of these. So it's there. Anyway, this is all kind of a diversion because we're talking about existing law. That's the existing law. And it's surprising to a lot of people, but that's the existing law. As Jerry was saying, the infrastructure bill would make this the law as well for cryptocurrency transactions. And that is, I think, much more likely to sweep up a whole lot of personal information, because I think you're more likely to make a transaction using digital currency of that value, of that size and magnitude, than you are in physical currency, not because you think it's an easier way to be sneaky or anything, but just because actually it's a much easier way to pay for things. It's that you don't have to carry around a large amount of physical cash. You can just use your phone.
And we already have tens of thousands of transactions probably a day that would qualify in cryptocurrency. You know what they're buying? Cryptocurrency. So if you are buying one token for another, where you're trading Ether for Bitcoin or whatever it is that you're doing in amounts over $10,000, not only do you have to collect and report information about your counterparty has to collect and report information on you.
It's both ways, yeah.
And the reason, so it's not just that we don't like this, Peter, it's that this is probably unconstitutional, and not just the expanded thing that would include crypto, but probably the existing law is unconstitutional. Not really, if this were to become law, it'll become our business in a big way. But even now, it's probably unconstitutional.
Yeah. So, not to focus the rest of the whole conversation on this, but in brief, the reason why under the Bank Secrecy Act, for example, or under the broker definition, it's okay for third parties to collect information about you and report it to the government without the government needing a warrant for that kind of invasive search of private personal financial records, is because they are third parties. And the third party doctrine, which was created in response to the Bank Secrecy Act by the Supreme Court in 1971 or 72, said, look, if you hand your information over to a third party, you lose your expectation of privacy about it. So if you hand your transaction records over to a bank because you choose to use them for banking services when you could just deal in cash instead, then you forego your privacy rights to all of your transactional details. The government can have them without a warrant. And that was a compromise that was struck by the Supreme Court, if you will, and a reading of the Fourth Amendment back in 1971. It's kind of a little worse for wear now that everything we do through third-party intermediaries, including something like a Zoom chat like we're doing right now. But, that applies. But all that aside, set that aside, this is not third-party reporting. This is not a third-party situation. There are only two parties here, the two parties to a transaction, one person paying and one person giving the goods for what they're paying for, or two people paying in cryptocurrency as a trade. So who's the third party who I willingly handed my information over to, and therefore lost my reasonable expectation of privacy over my transactional records? It doesn't exist. So,
and has a legitimate business purpose to keep that information.
As you said, an antique dealer does not need to know your social security number. In fact, it's a gross liability to have antique dealers collecting social security numbers of their customers when they're only likely going to get hacked, and then we'll have antique Equifax,
Okay, so that's what's in the bill, and that's why we don't like it. And so maybe we can sort of, looking at the time, maybe we should fast forward a little bit and say, why is this in the infrastructure bill? It's a pay for. The idea being, if you do all these things, the IRS will have a wider net from which to find revenue. Robin, how did it get here? How did it find its way here? Do we think? Because we don't know.
So we don't really know. We know, so Senator Portman was the sponsor of the provision in the infrastructure bill. We know that Senator Portman was interested in crypto tax issues. Their office had been engaging broadly. We were under the understanding that they were working on a comprehensive crypto tax bill that would help sort of further along some of the goals that we had been advocating for a while, more clarity in the space, some assurances about people and how they pay their taxes. And then all of a sudden, we started hearing that there might be a cryptocurrency, a crypto tax provision as a pay for. Like we said, originally we were like, well, having a crypto, maybe that could be enhanced 1099 reporting guidance, and that would be great. It could be good. It might not be bad. We've been asking for clarity around it for a while. So putting aside the definition of broker and who would be reported, who would be obligated. Feel like
in other, Robin, you would know this from your work on the Hill for years. Like, is it ever good though when your policy issue gets a dollar value put on it? It's like a ransom, right?
Well, I mean, some things like even just like you probably don't want to have anything done as a pay for like this, but it's like if this was how we were going to achieve 1099 reporting guidance, then after 6 years of trying to get it, we would not have like flipped the table over that. We would have been like, fair, okay, maybe it wouldn't have been perfect, but how it would have happened. Okay, so we were asking around, people weren't really engaging. It was like super secret. We come to find during the time when the provision was being considered in the Senate, and we were going back and forth with language, and the sponsors of the amendments and of the original amendment, and then sponsors of potential changes would go back to Treasury, and sort of through those conversations, the outlines of something along these lines became possible, right? Treasury was probably thinking about doing this. Treasury had regulations that would have done this, ready to go.
So which means
they would have done, which means that they would have had to issue a proposed rule, and it would have gone through an order of notice and comment.
Yeah, and what that would have done is, and by the way, this is all speculation on our part. This is what we're piecing together.
Speculation
from what we've learned, what we've observed. This is what we're piecing together. So Treasury would have had to interpret its existing definition of broker in the law to cover all the people that they think should be covered. And so they seem to be ready to do that. Mm-hmm. And then what happened, right?
And then Senator Portman was looking for ways to offset the spending. And so instead of having to go through the regular process, Treasury could give this provision to Senator Portman to be an amendment. Treasury would get their interpretive guidance codified without having to go through the process that Jerry just explained.
They could do something where they could interpret the definition of broker. What they would have been doing was interpreting the definition of broker to its limits, right? Now they get to just have a new definition, new expanded definition of broker in the law.
And it's codified. And so it comes from Congress, so they don't have their authority to do it wouldn't be questioned.
But the result would have been the same, right? The result would have been the same. In which case, how can Congress changing the law that makes no difference raise any money? It can't.
So anyway, okay. So, and in exchange for the codification of that, Senator Portman got a $28 billion pay for. Right. And so it worked for all sides. We don't know if that's truly the case. There might be some of this is true, some of it isn't, but it definitely gives us some explanation for how we got here.
Right. And so then what happened in the Senate? So again, there was an original draft that was shared with us by Senator Portman's office that had a really expansive definition of broker, and we and others were able to push back, bring pressure to bear, cajole, and so that was limited. So I think a better definition, but still
it was an improvement. It was an improvement over the original. And I just would like to stop you here to emphasize something.
Yeah.
I don't know if people really appreciate that what is now in the infrastructure bill, while it's not something we're happy with, it is actually an improvement over what it could have been because of the early work that we did along with a lot of other people. So what actually got put into the infrastructure bill as the language that we are now dealing with is better than it could have been.
And that's like 80% of the work we do at Coin Center is that kind of stuff that you never see because the thing was going to be terrible. And we were able to just simply educate folks like, oh, hey, if you do it this way, it's going to have these results. And they're like, oh, okay, thank you. And
and it's always that simple.
Better. Well, we try.
Yeah.
So then the bill's introduced and we oppose it. And it's clear to at least a few other senators that this makes no sense. And, partly because we bring it to their attention, partly because they're already hip to why this is terrible, partly because this is, the community is making noise about this. And so what happens? Robin.
So then we have, looking at the time, I'll just abbreviate the process.
Can I say something? I think we need to do part 1 and part 2. So I think part 1 is going to take
should
us.
This be like a cliffhanger? Like you shot JR?
I think it's going to take us through the bill passing in the Senate, and maybe part 2 we'll be able to talk about where things stand now since it got to the House, because this is it's going to take this long to do.
I think that sounds good. I don't even know if we're going to actually get to the bill passing in the Senate in the next few minutes, but because there was a lot that happened.
Yeah.
So there were a couple of different senators who identified the problems with this and who were willing to work with the community to develop a solution. And like all legislative processes, some people had some ideas, other people had other ideas. There was a lot of coming together around what the ideas would be. But ultimately, we ended up with 3 senators, Senator Wyden, who is the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Lummis, who's a newly elected senator who's on the Senate Banking Committee, Senator Toomey, who's the ranking member on the Senate Banking Committee, all came together and they coalesced around an idea that would fix the definition of broker. And Jerry, correct me, but did it also talk about the reporting information, or was the original Wyden-Lummis-Toomey amendment only about the broker definition?
I think it was only about the broker definition. And
so I think
so
I think there was a desire among that group to go farther, but they were constrained sort of by the political reality. So even the initial amendment, even the initial Wyden-Lummis-Toomey amendment was already sort of self-censored to something that they thought they could get done. They were really negotiating in good faith.
It's a pretty cool group too, right? Like just to put like some finer point on it, like you've got Wyden, who's like truly a hero of like internet rights back in the 90s and the 2000s when the internet was new. Like he stood up for encryption and things like that. He's a Democrat. You've got Toomey, who's like a very respected, long-standing member of the Senate and a very reasonable Republican, like smart, sharp on this stuff. And you've got Lummis, who's like new and passionate about Bitcoin and from Wyoming, right? Like it's a cool, like you can't really nail this down as to ideology. They're all a little different. So it's great because it's not partisan and they're all just passionate and people who like were able to figure this out fast compared to a lot of folks in the Senate, right?
Yes. then there was a lot of pressure on them from the community and from themselves to try to make this right. And it was I have to say, I really do applaud the leadership that all three of those senators showed, and their staff, who did tremendous work on this. So I think everybody who's listening to this who had anything to do with it would be like nodding their heads like, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we should I think maybe we should pause here. So we should pause here we have the Wyden-Lummis-Toomey Amendment that's introduced, and it was also supported, and this was unprecedented. The cryptocurrency industry ecosystem, us together with lots of other players, really came together and helped negotiate something that wasn't perfect for any of us, but we were all really working together, and that's incredibly uncommon.
Yeah.
And so I think that also is a story that came out of this. Yeah. And anyone who's listening will be like, yep, that was pretty spectacular.
And if we're gonna leave this as the cliffhanger, it's like, tune in next time to find out how it all fell apart.
No, but did it?
All right. All right. So we'll leave it here, and we'll see you next time for part 2. Bye, guys.